space and like space travel and like being like a young optimist in space, like entrepreneurial, like this is totally like a swan song, you know, like that's what it is. It's like who cares if it's a dream, really?
Numinous clawed his way up the snowbank, his calves and feet submerged in the Arctic waters. Wind ripped through his hair. He felt the liquid to be a black hole sucking his energy out from his toes, leaving his arms like feeble toothpicks flailing through jello to lift himself upward. With much effort he made it, stood atop the snowbank and looked over his left shoulder. "Where's the boat?" His mate stood a few feet from him and responded, "Well, that's okay. I don't die in sub-zero temperatures, no matter how cold it gets." Numinous looked out upon the waters, observing shelves of ice bobbing up and down. But what held his eye open wasn't the moist frost that stuck to his lashes, but the massive orange and yellow vortex that hung on the bottom of the horizon like a tornado turned sideways, that sucked into itself but also cast luminous red, yellow, and orange rays in all directions from its center. Numinous said, "It's beautiful." A wino slumped in a snowdrift lifted his head and said, "I'm sick of everybody calling everything beautiful." Numinous noted the objection and inwardly realized that perhaps he too had contributed to deflating the essence of this word, as he tossed it about like one might pitch already cracked and masticated sunflower seeds. Numinous acknowledged the factual absence of the boat and headed back more inland, although everywhere he ended up still seemed to be just beyond the edge of these Arctic waters. He found himself in a room full of people, speaking with his mother in a hushed tone. The story unfolded backwards as he realized that his parents and he had fled there and left their cozy, warm home back in Minnesota. His mom told him she had a box that contained everything the family would need to survive, enough money for lifetimes, all the important things. Numinous screamed at her, "What? Why didn't you bring it?" Her voice got lower. She said it was hidden in a most obvious place in their house where nobody would think to look. Numinous asked where, and she said something, and he got a visual image of one of the cabinets opening in the kitchen. She said everything one could ever need or want was in that box, and she passed him a stone. It was a small and pink and smooth, and somehow Numinous knew inside that this was the Rosetta Stone, and that it was the key to opening that box. Numinous had business to be about, and he held the stone tightly, which seemed to glow and sparkle and twinkle in his hand. His mother folded his fingers over it as if it was the last piece of advice she would ever give. They were in some sort of barn or warehouse, and there were crowds of people all around. The whole transaction with his mother had been very discreet, and she was afraid to even talk about the location of the box after she'd brought it up. But when Numinous asked, she told him. He held the stone in his hand, wrapped tightly, and headed up a snow-covered trail to a tiny craftsman's shop that was lit with a soft candle glow and appeared at the edge of the road amidst the snowdrifts. It was totally unaffected by the environmental surroundings. In fact, the small craftsman's shop looked quite cozy as he forged his way against an oncoming wind. Numinous decided to walk up and open the door. It took Numinous some time to realize that the craftsman he was looking at wasn't in fact animate. When he took a closer inspection, he saw that the neck and face and head were made of smooth brown wood, and that the puppet had predetermined paths that it could function through and execute within the room. Much like on some fancy clock towers, there are tiny figurines that come out on the hour and execute some predetermined function of a pre-laid track, then go back inside the clock. This was strange for Numinous because he didn't see any tracks laid down for this puppet man, except for one string attached to his head that went up. But Numinous never thought to look up to see what it was attached to. It just kind of hovered like a rising serpent above the back of his head, and occasionally something would move it, and the puppet would awkwardly jostle itself across the room to execute some task. After observing the creature in its habitat more carefully, Numinous realized that this was in fact a puppeteer's workshop, but quite unexpectedly, amidst the tiny human-proportioned dolls and strings and noses and buttons and face paint, the puppeteer himself was in fact an inanimate puppet. An inanimate puppet that, despite an immobile mouth, began speaking to him. Before Numinous grasped what he was saying, the puppeteer was jerked across the room to a corner with sharp needle points and orange, yellow, and green rice paper. Numinous wanted to test the free ability of this supposedly inanimate puppet, so just as he was about to commence a preset task in that corner of the shop, Numinous plucked his connecting string that had caused him to clunkily slide that way in the first place. What resulted was the puppet going farther than it should have, and going through the routine of pushing needles into a paper, a full meter away from the needles and paper. This convinced Numinous of the lack of agency of this wooden man-like puppeteer, and he reattached the string, which instantly caused the puppeteer to swing back into the correct position and begin stabbing the paper with needles in a most concentrated manner. Numinous got the feeling he was punching Morse code, and while watching the puppeteer work so intensely, he once again began to think it a human of sorts. Then the puppeteer jerked up from his corner, swung back to face Numinous, and approached his face with the needle and ink. At first Numinous was scared. He'd never been tattooed. But the puppeteer spoke in a robotic voice and said, while beginning to poke Numinous's cheeks repeatedly, "Time code 810-108-110. Time code 810-108-110. 108. And continued saying numbers in a rapid order, with some kind of cyclical pattern. Just as Numinous became scared of having these numbers on his face, the puppeteer spoke in a robot's voice. Invisible ink, 810-108-110, 810-108-110, 810-108-110-811-10-10-108-110-2-2-10-110. And went on like that. The whole happening took about 3 minutes. The tattoo itself only 30 seconds, and Numinous walked out of that little shed with the code of the universe tattooed in invisible ink on his face, a piece of paper with small needle holes that he felt were numerically coded, but didn't know for sure, and he realized his not knowing for sure is exactly what would keep him safe. He squeezed his hand to make sure the stone was still there, and it was shining in pink. He ran his fingers over his face but felt nothing. It hadn't even hurt while he'd been getting the tattoo. Then he walked back down to town to the ledge that went into those icy waters to stare at that pulsing sideways tornado with iridescent colors shooting out over the bleak icy grays and whites of this Arctic storm. On his way down he stopped in one place because he noticed snow wasn't falling around him, but everything was actually hovering in a suspended gravity. All these little objects sat on the air in a seemingly buoyant elixir that held everything up. Numinous hollered at a few passerbys to come look at this, for he felt he should document it, or at least get a second opinion. But the passerbys didn't take an interest, so he was left alone to ponder the gravitylessness of the situation. It struck him as strange, and he suddenly thought of pigs and frogs, and then the apocalypse, and then how that orange reservoir reminded him of the Fountain of Youth, which he'd never seen before, so he didn't understand how it could remind him of it. "It's beautiful," he said in stupor awe. "Don't say that word, it means nothing." But it was. Numinous felt that way, and he suddenly didn't care that the boat wasn't coming, and let his eyes fall into the swirling orange and red, and imagine what power could create such a thing. "Whatever it was," Numinous said, "it sure is beautiful."